You've been lied to. When you picture a Viking, you likely see a filthy savage caked in mud and blood. But the historical reality is the exact opposite. In the 10th century, English monks weren't just terrified of the Vikings' axes, they were terrified of their baths. Historical records prove that Norsemen were actually the best-groomed men in Europe, using daily hair combing and weekly spa rituals to seduce noblewomen away from their unwashed English husbands. Forget the gritty TV dramas, the real Vikings weaponized hygiene to conquer England. It is time to scrub away the dirt and reveal the cleanest scandal of the Dark Ages. But before we step into the sauna, I'm curious, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it on your clock? Let me know in the comments below. To understand the hygiene of the Norsemen, we first have to dismantle the centuries of propaganda that have built the image of the dirty savage. This idea didn't start with Hollywood costume designers. It started with the victims of the Vikings. History, as they say, is written by the victors, but in the case of the Viking Age, history was largely written by the literate monks and priests who were terrified of these heathens. When you are writing about the men who just burned down your monastery and stole your gold, you aren't exactly motivated to compliment their hair routine. You want to depict them as monsters. You want to dehumanize them. You paint them as distinct from civilized Christian society, and the easiest way to do that is to portray them as filthy animals. However, when we stop reading the propaganda and start looking at the physical evidence, a completely different picture emerges. When archaeologists dig up Viking grave sites, they find swords, yes. They find axes, shields, and spearheads. But do you know what the single most common artifact found in Viking Age excavations is? It isn't a weapon of war, it is a comb. Thousands upon thousands of combs. Some are simple and utilitarian, others are intricately carved from deer antler, reinforced with bronze rivets and decorated with complex geometric patterns. These were not disposable items. They were treasured personal possessions, often kept in specialized carrying cases attached to a belt, right next to the knife. A Viking warrior would no sooner go into the afterlife without his sword than he would without his comb. This single fact, the ubiquity of the comb, should be enough to shatter the illusion of the messy, tangled barbarian. You do not spend hours carving a high-quality comb if you don't care about your hair. But the evidence goes far beyond just combs. We have written accounts from the Viking Age that inadvertently reveal the truth. One of the most famous and perhaps most amusing sources comes from John of Wallingford, an English chronicler writing in the medieval period. He wasn't writing to praise the Vikings, he was writing to complain about them. He noted with great irritation that the Danes, the Vikings who had settled in England, were causing a massive social problem. And what was this problem? Were they slaughtering too many people? Were they burning too many churches? No. The problem, according to Wallingford, was that the Danish men were too attractive to the English women. He wrote that the Vikings caused much trouble for the native English men because the Vikings were in the habit of combing their hair every single day, bathing once a week, and changing their clothes frequently. Wallingford lamented that because of these frivolous habits of cleanliness, the Vikings were able to seduce the married women of the English nobility and even the daughters of powerful lords. Think about the implications of that statement for a moment. The English chronicler is essentially admitting that the local Anglo-Saxon men, who were Christians and supposedly civilized, smelled so bad and looked so unkempt compared to the Vikings that the women preferred the invaders. It turns out that the savage Vikings were the metrosexuals of the Dark Ages. This cleanliness was not just a matter of vanity. It was deeply embedded in their culture and even their language. In the upcoming sections of this documentary, we are going to dissect the Norse week and reveal how their very calendar revolved around washing. We are going to look at the chemistry of the soaps they made, which did more than just clean. It transformed their appearance in a way that was terrifying to their enemies. We are going to explore the sauna culture that kept them healthy in the freezing Scandinavian winters. And we will even look at the strict laws they had regarding personal grooming. Yes, laws. In Iceland, you could legally be punished for pushing someone into the mud and dirtying their clothes. However, we must also be fair and balanced. We cannot swing the pendulum too far the other way and claim they were sterile, modern germaphobes. They lived in a time without running water, without antibiotics, and without modern sewage systems. Later in this series, we will descend into the latrines of Jorvik to look at the parasites and diseases that plagued them despite their best efforts. We will look at the contrasting account of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveller who met a group of Vikings on the Volga River in Russia and was absolutely disgusted by their morning wash routine. His account is often used as proof that Vikings were dirty, but when we analyse it closely, we realise it might actually prove the opposite, that they washed religiously, just not in the way a Muslim traveller from the Caliphate was used to. By the end of this journey, you will never look at a Viking movie the same way again. When you see a character on screen with mud caked on his face and grease in his hair, you will know that a real Viking would have looked at that man with utter contempt. To a Norseman, cleanliness was not just about hygiene, it was about dignity, self-respect, and status. A man who did not care for his appearance was a man who had given up. So, strip away the Hollywood dirt. Forget the grimy filters used by modern directors. We are about to step into the longhouse, heat up the water, and discover the surprising, scrubbed-clean reality of the Viking Age. If you look at the calendar on your wall right now, or the one on your phone, you will see the days of the week named after celestial bodies and ancient gods. In English, the days are a hodgepodge of Roman and Germanic influences. Tuesday is Tyr's Day. Wednesday is Woden's or Odin's Day. Thursday is Thor's Day. Friday is Frigg's Day. The Vikings have stamped their pantheon all over our modern concept of time. But then we get to Saturday. In English, Saturday is named after the Roman god Saturn, Saturn's Day. It stands out as the odd one out, a relic of the Roman Empire that the Germanic tribes didn't bother to change. But if you travel to Scandinavia today, to Norway, Sweden or Denmark, and ask a local what day it is, they won't say Saturday. In Danish and Norwegian, it is lørdag. In Swedish, lørdag. In Icelandic, the language closest to Old Norse, it is laugardagur. This isn't just a linguistic quirk, it is a smoking gun in our investigation into Viking hygiene. You see, these words don't refer to a god. They don't refer to a planet. They are direct descendants of the Old Norse word laugardagur. and Laugardaga translates literally and indisputably to washing day, bath day, or pool day. Think about that for a moment. The Vikings, the supposed destroyers of civilization, the men depicted as grimy heathens, felt that the act of bathing was so central to their existence that they literally named 1/7 of their lives after it. While the rest of Europe was naming days after the sun, the moon, and powerful deities, the Vikings dedicated a specific day of the week to getting scrubbed clean. This was not a metaphorical, spiritual cleansing. This was a literal, physical, soap and water scrub. Laugardaga was a cultural institution. It was a rhythm of life that dictated the schedule of every farmstead and village from the fjords of Norway to the settlements in Iceland. To understand why this was so shocking to their contemporaries, we have to look at the hygiene standards of the rest of Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries. The Christian world was in a complicated relationship with bathing. The Roman Empire, famous for its massive public bath complexes, had collapsed centuries prior. While people in the medieval era certainly weren't as filthy as popular myths suggest, they did wash their hands and faces, and they did rinse off visible dirt. The concept of full-body immersion, of soaking in hot water for pleasure and cleanliness, had largely fallen out of fashion in many areas. In fact, some early Christian ascetics viewed excessive bathing as a sign of vanity or even sinfulness. To be too concerned with the flesh was to neglect the spirit. A little bit of dirt was sometimes seen as a badge of piety. Into this world sailed the Vikings, who viewed things very differently. For the Norse, Saturday wasn't just the end of the work week, it was a ritual reset. Imagine a typical Viking farmstead on a Saturday afternoon. The hard labour of the week is winding down. The men have returned from the fields, the wood chopping, or the smithy. They are covered in sweat, soot, and the grime of physical labour. In an Anglo-Saxon village, this might be the state they remained in until Sunday church, or perhaps they would do a quick basin wash. But in the Viking household, the preparations for Laugardaga began early. The women of the household, or the thralls, slaves, would begin the arduous task of heating water. This was no small feat. There were no taps to turn, no boilers to ignite. Water had to be hauled from the nearest stream or well, bucket by heavy bucket. Large stones were placed in the central hearth fire until they glowed red hot. These stones were then dropped into a large wooden tub filled with water, causing it to hiss and steam, raising the temperature to a comfortable heat. This was a luxury. It required fuel, labour, and time. The fact that they did this weekly speaks volumes about their priorities. A society struggling merely to survive does not waste precious firewood heating bath water every 7 days. The existence of Laugardaga implies a society that valued comfort and well-being. The bath itself was often a communal or semi-communal affair, though not necessarily in a promiscuous sense. It was family time. It was a time to shed the armour, the heavy wool tunics, and the layers of protection needed against the harsh northern climate. But Laugardaga wasn't just about hot water. It was about what happened in the water. This is where the difference between rinsing and grooming becomes clear. The Vikings didn't just sit in the water, they worked at it. This was the day for deep cleaning. We have evidence that they used stripping agents to remove the oils from their hair, something we will discuss in detail in the section on soap. They scrubbed their skin. They didn't just let the dirt fall off, they chased it away. This weekly ritual had profound social implications. In the close quarters of a Viking longhouse, where families slept on benches lining the walls and gathered around a central fire, body odour would have been a potent issue. If everyone smelled terrible, perhaps no one would notice. But in a culture that prioritised a weekly deep clean, the person who didn't bathe would be the outcast. The stinky Viking would likely have been shamed by his peers, not celebrated as a tough warrior. There is also a component of mental health and morale here. Living in the north, with its biting winds, freezing rains, and long months of darkness, can be physically and psychologically draining. The Saturday bath was a restorative act. The heat of the water would soothe muscles sore from rowing or farming. The removal of grime would help prevent lice and skin infections, which were constant threats in the ancient world. When a Viking stepped out of that tub on Saturday evening, dried himself by the fire, and put on his fresh set of clothes, he was reclaiming his humanity from the harsh elements. This helps explain the seduction narrative we touched on in the introduction. When the English chronicler John of Wallingford complained that Vikings combed their hair daily and bathed every Saturday, he wasn't just listing random habits. He was describing a level of self-care that signalled status. In a world where life was short and brutal, taking the time to care for your body was a sign of wealth and self-respect. An English woman looking at a Viking settler saw a man who had the resources and the discipline to keep himself clean. That was attractive. It signalled that he was a good provider, a man who had his life in order. Furthermore, Laugardagr had a ceremonial function. The Vikings were a deeply superstitious and ritualistic people. While we don't have a specific prayer for bathing, we know that many of their rituals required a certain level of purity. You didn't approach the gods covered in filth if you could help it. While it wasn't the same as the ritual ablutions of Islam or Judaism, the Norse concept of being clean likely blurred the lines between physical hygiene and spiritual readiness. To be clean was to be ready. Ready for the feast, ready for the assembly, the thing, or ready to meet a guest. It is also worth noting that this tradition was so strong that it survived the conversion to Christianity. When Scandinavia slowly turned away from the old gods and embraced the cross, they had to give up horse meat, they had to give up exposure of unwanted infants, and they had to give up temple sacrifices. But they did not give up Laugardagr. The missionaries who came north, often from England or Germany, found a people who were stubborn about their bath day. The church eventually had to accept it. Even today, over 1,000 years later, the word remains. Every time a modern Norwegian says, "Have a good Saturday," "God lørdag," they are unknowingly paying homage to the bathtubs of their pagan ancestors. So, the next time you see a movie where a Viking looks like he hasn't touched water since birth, remember the calendar. Remember that these men and women lived their lives on a cycle that culminated in cleanliness. They didn't fear the water, they invited it into their homes. They didn't wear dirt as camouflage, they scrubbed it off as a weekly duty. But a bath is only as good as the tools you use. Hot water alone can only do so much. To truly achieve the Viking look, the look that stole hearts and terrified monks, you needed hardware. You needed precision instruments. And as we dig deeper into the Viking grave goods, we find that the toolkit of a warrior looked a lot less like a butcher's block and a lot more like a modern beauty salon. If you visit a museum dedicated to the Viking Age, whether it's in Oslo, Stockholm or York, you will inevitably be drawn to the weapons. The curators know this. They put the rusted swords, the heavy iron axe heads, and the bosses of shields under the brightest spotlights. These are the items that scream Viking. They tell the story of the raid, the conquest, the violence. They fit the narrative we have been sold. But if you look away from the centre of the room, if you lean in close to the glass cabinets lining the walls, you will see the real story. You will see the items that were actually held in Viking hands far more often than any sword. You will see the contents of the Viking vanity case. It is a statistical fact that in many excavation sites, grooming tools outnumber weapons. Let that sink in. When we dig up the settlements where these people lived, and died, we find more evidence of hair care than warfare. If aliens were to judge the Viking civilization solely by the frequency of artifacts found in the ground, they might conclude that the Norsemen were a race of barbers, not warriors. The undisputed king of these artifacts is the comb. Now you might be thinking of the cheap plastic comb you have in your bathroom drawer, a disposable, mass-produced item you wouldn't think twice about losing. You need to erase that image. A Viking comb was a masterpiece of engineering and art. First, let's talk about the material. They didn't use wood for their high-quality combs. Wood warps when it gets wet, and in the damp, freezing climate of Scandinavia, a wooden comb would snap or bend within weeks. Instead, they used red deer antler. Antler is an incredibly tough, resilient material. It doesn't warp in water, and it is strong enough to untangle the thickest, most matted hair without breaking the teeth. But you can't just carve a comb out of a raw antler. The shape is wrong. So, Viking craftsmen developed a complex composite construction technique. They would saw the antler into flat plates, sandwich them between two connecting bars, and rivet them together with bronze or iron pins. Then, with painstaking precision, they would saw the teeth into the plates. Finally, the whole thing would be polished to a shine and decorated with ring and dot patterns or interlacing beast motifs. These were not items you made yourself by the fire. You bought these from a professional. We have found evidence of specialized comb makers' workshops in trading towns like Birka and Hedeby, where piles of antler waste and half-finished combs reveal an industrial-scale production. This was big business. A good comb was expensive. It was a status symbol. And they didn't just throw these expensive items in a sack. We often find combs associated with their own carrying cases, protecting sheaths made of matching antler or leather. A Viking warrior would wear his comb case on his belt, right alongside his knife. Think about the signal that sends. In a violent, dangerous world, the two things you need at your hip are a blade to defend your life and a comb to fix your hair. It suggests that looking good was, in some way, as vital as being dangerous. But the vanity kit didn't stop at hair. This is where things get surprisingly detailed, and perhaps a little intimate. Alongside the combs, archaeologists frequently find small, delicate metal scoops. They look like tiny spoons, often made of bronze, silver, or even gold for the ultra-wealthy. For years, Victorian antiquarians were puzzled by these. Were they for measuring medicine, Spices? Poison? No, they were ear spoons. The Vikings were obsessed with cleaning the wax out of their ears. Now, to a modern audience, a reusable metal ear scoop might sound slightly repulsive. But in the context of the 9th century, it is revolutionary. It shows a concern for personal hygiene that goes down to the smallest detail. This isn't just about looking clean from a distance. This is about being clean in the nooks and crannies. These ear spoons were often threaded onto a ring, like a keychain, along with another surprising tool, tweezers. Yes, tweezers. Small, spring-loaded metal pincers are ubiquitous in Viking finds. And they weren't for pulling splinters out of rough hands. They were for plucking hair. We know from both the artifacts and the literary sources that Viking men and women were meticulous about facial hair. While the beard was a symbol of masculinity, which we will cover next, an unruly beard was not. They used these tweezers to pluck stray hairs, to shape the beard lines, and perhaps even to shape their eyebrows. There is even some evidence to suggest that both men and women removed hair from other parts of their bodies, though that remains a subject of debate among scholars. What is not up for debate is the presence of razors. We find distinct, heavy-bladed iron razors that were clearly designed for shaving. This challenges the stereotype that every Viking had a wizard-like beard that grew wild. Many men shaved parts of their faces, necks, or heads. The razor had to be kept razor sharp, literally, using whetstones, which are also commonly found drilled with holes so they could be worn on the belt. So, picture the everyday carry, EDC, of a Viking jarl. He has his sword, yes. He has his pouch of silver coins. But hanging prominently from his leather belt, jingling as he walks, is a grooming kit. A polished antler comb in a decorated case. A silver ear spoon. A pair of bronze tweezers and a nail cleaner. This visual completely disrupts the savage narrative. A savage does not carry a nail cleaner. A savage does not spend the equivalent of a week's wages on a comb. The placement of these items in graves is the final clinching piece of evidence. In the Viking belief system, particularly in the pre-Christian era, grave goods were functional. You were buried with what you needed for the journey to the afterlife and for your existence in Valhalla or Folkvanga. Warriors were buried with weapons to fight. Smiths were buried with hammers to forge. Seeresses were buried with their staffs of magic. And almost everyone was buried with a comb. This implies that even in the afterlife, even in the great hall of Odin, where the mead flows and the battles never end, you were expected to fix your hair. You couldn't show up to the feast of the gods looking like a mess. Personal grooming was a transcendental value. It mattered in this world, and it mattered in the next. One specific find at the Oseberg ship burial, a magnificent grave for 2 high-status women in Norway, included a whole collection of hygiene tools. But it's not just the queens. Even in humbler graves, where there is no gold and no sword, you will often find the remains of a simple bone comb. It was the one luxury a poor man would not part with. So, the archaeology is screaming at us. It is telling us that the Vikings were vain. They were peacocking. They cared deeply about their presentation. They understood that in a warrior society, your appearance was the first weapon you drew. If you looked sharp, groomed, and disciplined, you were formidable. If you looked unkempt, you were weak. But what exactly were they doing with all these combs and razors? What was the Viking look they were trying to achieve? It turns out the fashion trends of the 9th century were far more specific and far more bizarre than anything you'll see in a Marvel movie. We have established that the Vikings had the tools to groom themselves. They had the combs, the razors, and the tweezers. But having a paintbrush doesn't tell you what the painting looks like. To understand the Viking aesthetic, we have to look at how they actually wore their hair and beards. And I have to warn you, if you are picturing the rugged, messy biker look from TV shows, you are in for a shock. The reality was far more stylized, far more colourful, and, frankly, a little bit weird to modern eyes. Let's start with the colour. In the world of the Vikings, gentlemen preferred blondes, and gentlemen were preferred if they were blonde. Golden hair was the ultimate beauty standard for both men and women. It was associated with the gods, with light, and with the aristocracy. But genetics doesn't always cooperate. Many Vikings, especially those from Denmark or those with mixed heritage from thralls captured in other lands, had brown or black hair. So they fixed it. They practiced one of the earliest forms of cosmetic biohacking, bleaching. We have accounts from Roman historians like Pliny the Elder writing about the Germanic tribes, the ancestors of the Norse, describing how they used a special soap made of goat fat and beechwood ash. This mixture was highly alkaline. It was essentially a potent lye soap. When left in the hair for extended periods, the caustic lye would strip the pigment, turning brown hair red and dark blonde hair into a blinding platinum white. This wasn't a subtle highlight. This was a chemical assault on the follicle. But it had a brilliant double function. The high lye content didn't just bleach the hair, it killed everything living in it. This beauty treatment was also the nuclear option for head lice. In an age where parasites were a constant plague, the blonde Vikings weren't just fashionable, they were the ones who weren't scratching their heads. This likely reinforced the association between blonde hair and high status. If you had golden hair, you were clean, wealthy, and healthy. Now, let's talk about the cut. If you walk into a barber shop today and ask for a Viking cut, the barber will probably give you an undercut, shaved sides, long on top, maybe a braid. It looks cool, it looks warrior-like. But if you walked into a 10th century Danish village with that haircut, they might look at you with confusion. One of the most authentic visual sources we have for Viking hair comes from the Bayeux tapestry. This massive embroidery depicts the Norman conquest of England in 1066. The Normans were the direct descendants of Vikings, Norsemen, who settled in France. At the time of the conquest, they retained many Norse fashion sensibilities, and on the tapestry we see a hairstyle that has been almost entirely ignored by Hollywood because, to be honest, it looks ridiculous to modern sensibilities. It was the reverse mullet. The tapestry clearly shows warriors with long fringes, bangs, in the front, but the back of their heads is shaved completely bald, almost up to the crown of the skull. The neck is entirely exposed. Why on earth would they do this? It wasn't just a fashion statement, it was tactical. When you put on a chainmail coif or a helmet, long hair at the back of the neck is a liability. It gets caught in the mail links. It gets sweaty and matted under the helmet's neck guard. By shaving the back of the head, the Viking warrior kept his neck cool and free of tangles, while the long hair on top could still be styled to look intimidating. A letter from an English monk explicitly advises his brother not to adopt the Danish fashion of a shaved neck and blinded eyes, long bangs, calling it a shameful pagan style. That monk's disapproval is our historical proof. The reverse mullet was the mark of the raider, but not everyone wore this. We also have evidence of long hair, worn loose or braided. A king like Harold Fairhair famously vowed not to cut or comb his hair until he had united all of Norway. When he finally did, and got a haircut, he was renowned for his beautiful flowing locks. This tells us that length was a symbol of a vow or a transition. Hair held power. To cut a free man's hair against his will was a grave insult, grounds for a blood feud. And then there is the beard. The beard, skegg, was the epicenter of a Viking man's masculinity. But again, erase the image of the wild, bushy wizard beard that grows halfway down the chest with twigs stuck in it. Viking beards were groomed. They were shaped. We have carvings of Viking heads that show beards that are neatly trimmed, pointed, or even forked into two distinct braids. The moustache was often kept long and integrated into the beard. The comb, we discussed in Part 3, was used religiously on the beard. A tangled beard was the sign of a madman or an outlaw, a skogarmaur, man of the forest. A man of society kept his facial hair impeccable. The cultural importance of the beard was codified in law. In the ancient Icelandic law codes known as graugas, the grey goose laws, there are specific penalties for damaging a man's beard. If you were in a fight and you cut a man's beard, the fine was heavy. If you grabbed a man by the beard to humiliate him, you might have to pay with your life. There was even a specific vocabulary of insults related to the beard. To call a man taðskegglingur, dung-beard, was a surefire way to start a duel to the death. To imply a man was beardless, smooth-faced like a woman or a boy, was the ultimate slur against his courage and manhood. This is famously illustrated in Njal's saga, where the hero Njal is mocked by his enemies as old beardless, because he had trouble growing facial hair. This insult eventually leads to the burning of his house and the death of his entire family. In the Viking world, you did not joke about a man's facial hair unless you were ready to draw steel. For women, hair was equally symbolic, but it signalled marital status rather than aggression. Unmarried girls typically wore their hair loose and flowing, perhaps with a simple band or circlet. It was a sign of youth and availability. But once a woman married, the hair was often put up. We see depictions of the Viking knot, a complex hairstyle where the hair is gathered into a tight knot at the back of the head, looking almost like a ponytail loop. We also see the use of linen caps and scarves. The terrifying Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, are almost always depicted with long flowing hair, sometimes pulled back into a ponytail that trails behind them as they ride. This flowing hair represents their wild, supernatural power, unbound by the social constraints of human marriage. Interestingly, archaeology also suggests that Viking women used the same tools as men. They had the combs, the tweezers, the ear spoons. The idea that women prettify themselves and men just exist is a later, perhaps Victorian invention. In the Viking Age, both sexes were engaged in an arms race of grooming. Imagine a Viking feast. The hall is lit by the flickering firelight. The tables are packed. You look around, and you don't see a room full of mud-caked savages. You see a room full of people with hair bleached platinum blonde by lye, shining in the firelight. You see men with the backs of their heads shaved clean, their long fringes swept back or parted. You see beards that are combed, oiled, and perhaps braided with small silver rings. You see women with complex knotted hairstyles secured with silver pins. They smell of wood smoke, yes, but also of the piney, soapy scent of their grooming products. They look distinct. They look sharp. They look like a cohesive cultural unit that uses their appearance to say, "We are the Northmen. We are disciplined, and we are better than you." This obsession with hair and grooming brings us to a practical question. If you are bleaching your hair, shaving your neck, and scrubbing your skin every week, where are you doing it? You can't do all of this in a wooden bucket in the middle of the living room. You need a facility. You need heat. You need steam. It turns out the Vikings didn't just borrow the bath from the rest of Europe. They might have perfected it. It's time to step out of the cold and into the steam-filled world of the northern spa. Imagine the Scandinavian winter. It is a cold that seeps into your bones, a darkness that lasts for 20 hours a day. The wind off the North Sea feels like a physical blow. In this environment, warmth is not just comfort, it is survival. And for the Vikings, the ultimate warmth and the ultimate clean came from the bathstova. While the Romans are famous for their marble bath complexes with underfloor heating and aqueducts, the Vikings developed a rougher, more elemental version of the spa. It was less about architectural grandeur and more about intense, purifying heat. This was the ancestor of the modern Finnish sauna and the Russian banya. We need to distinguish between two types of Viking bathing experiences, the geothermal and the man-made. If you were a Viking settler in Iceland, you had hit the Hygiene jackpot. The island is essentially a boiling kettle of volcanic activity. Hot springs, or laugar, there's that word again, bubble up from the ground naturally. The famous Snorralog, Snorri's pool, in Reykholt, Iceland, is a perfect surviving example. Built by the famous chieftain and historian Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, at the tail end of the Viking Age, it is a circular, stone-lined pool fed by a natural hot spring through a stone conduit. Imagine the luxury of that. While the rest of Europe was hauling buckets of cold water from wells, Icelandic Vikings were lounging in natural hot tubs, drinking mead and discussing politics under the northern lights. These hot springs became social hubs. In the sagas, we frequently read about people meeting at the bath. It was the coffee shop, the boardroom, and the pub all rolled into one. Heroes and villains in the stories are often depicted soaking in these pools, plotting feuds or resolving disputes. But for the Vikings back in Norway, Sweden and Denmark, or the settlers in England, the ground did not provide hot water. They had to manufacture it. This gave rise to the bathstove, bathroom, or the separate bathhouse building. Unlike the main longhouse, which was vast and draughty, the bathhouse was small, tight and insulated with turf or heavy timber to trap every ounce of heat. The technology was simple but brutal. A pile of stones would be built up over a fire, a stove of sorts. Once the stones were glowing red hot, the fire was allowed to die down, or the stones were moved and water was thrown over them. The result was an explosion of steam, eimer. This wasn't a gentle mist. This was a suffocating, intense wall of heat that forced the body to sweat profusely. The Vikings understood, perhaps intuitively, that sweating was a way to purge the body. It softened the hardened skin of the farmer and the warrior. It opened the pores. After sitting in the steam until they could barely stand it, they would scrub themselves down, often using bunches of birch twigs to stimulate circulation, a practice still common in Nordic saunas today. Then came the shock. To close the pores and wake up the system, they would transition from the extreme heat to extreme cold. They would roll in the snow or plunge into a freezing fjord. This cycle of heat and cold, vasodilation and vasoconstriction, is incredibly invigorating. It boosts the immune system and releases endorphins. When a Viking warrior emerged from this process, he wasn't just clean, he was high on his own biology. He felt reborn. We have archaeological evidence of these bathhouses. In York, Jorvik, the Viking capital of England, excavations have revealed small, sunken structures with evidence of water drainage and heated stones. These weren't in the palaces of kings. They were in the backyards of regular craftspeople. This suggests that the steam bath wasn't an aristocratic privilege. It was a common necessity. However, the bathhouse was not always a place of safety. Because it was a place where people were naked and unarmed, it became a favourite setting for assassination in Norse literature. The sagas are full of bathhouse murders. In Eyrbyggja saga, a character is trapped in a bathhouse when his enemies block the door and pile rocks over the steam vent, trying to cook him alive. In other stories, enemies wait until a man is relaxed in the tub to strike. The fact that the bathhouse appears so often as a setting for drama proves how central it was to their daily lives. But there is another layer to the bathhouse, the spiritual. In the Norse worldview, boundaries were important. The boundary between the wild and the home, utengard and innengard. The boundary between the living and the dead. The bathhouse was a liminal space. It was where you stripped off your social armour. It was where a woman went to give birth. The steam helped with labour pains, and the water was needed for cleaning. It was where the dead were washed before burial. It was a place of transformation. You went in dirty, tired and cold. You came out clean, energised and warm. This obsession with heat and steam also helps explain the Viking expansion. When they sailed to new lands, one of their first priorities was establishing these facilities. In Newfoundland, Canada, at the Lanceau Meadows site, the only confirmed Viking settlement in North America, archaeologists found evidence of what might be a bathhouse. Think about that. They travelled across the known world to a continent no European had ever seen, and one of the first things they thought to build was a sauna. This infrastructure of cleanliness stands in stark contrast to the common misconception of the stinking medieval peasant. While it is true that public bathhouses in Europe declined after the Roman period, often due to church disapproval of the promiscuity that happened there, the North kept the tradition alive. They didn't need marble columns or aqueducts, they just needed fire, stone, and water. The bathstoffe eventually evolved. In later centuries in Iceland, as wood became scarce, the bathstoffe moved inside the main house and became the primary living and sleeping room because it was the warmest place. But in the Viking Age proper, it was a dedicated sanctuary of hygiene. So we have the tools, the combs, the style, the bleached hair, and the facility, the sauna. But there is one crucial element missing. You can sit in steam all day, but if you don't have a cleaning agent, you're just wet and sweaty. You need soap. And the Vikings didn't just buy soap, they brewed it. And the recipe they used was, quite literally, strong enough to peel paint. We have scrubbed the Viking warrior from head to toe. His hair is bleached, his beard is combed, and his skin has been steamed in the sauna. But a clean body is useless if you wrap it in filthy rags. To truly understand the Viking look, we have to talk about their clothes, and specifically the surprisingly aggressive chemistry they used to keep them clean. This brings us to a topic that usually gets skipped in polite history books: the role of urine in Viking fashion. But before we get to the shock factor, let's talk about soap. Today, we buy soap in neat bars or plastic bottles, scented like lavender or ocean breeze. In the Viking Age, soap was a byproduct of survival. The ingredients were right there in the hearth and the slaughterhouse. The Vikings made soft soap. The process is chemically simple but physically demanding. You take animal fat, tallow from sheep or cattle, which the Vikings had in abundance, and you boil it. Then you add lye. But you can't just buy lye, you have to make it. You take the white ash from your wood fires, specifically from hardwoods like beech or birch, mix it with water and let it leach out. The resulting liquid is potassium hydroxide, potash. When you mix this caustic potash with the animal fat and boil it down, a chemical reaction called saponification occurs. The result isn't the hard bar soap we know today. That requires soda ash, which was harder to get in the north, but a gooey, soft, gel-like substance. This Viking soap was potent. It was high pH, meaning it was incredibly effective at stripping grease and dirt, but it was also harsh on the skin. This is why the bleaching effect on hair happened. The soap was literally chemically burning the pigment out. When used on clothes, it was a heavy-duty degreaser. But for the Vikings, clean wasn't enough. They wanted bright. In Norse poetry and sagas, high-status individuals are often described as shining or bright. The god Heimdall is called the white god. A beautiful woman is described as having arms as white as the snow. Whiteness and brightness were proxies for wealth, divinity, and purity. and the fabric that signalled this best was linen. Underneath the rough, scratchy wool tunics that protected them from the rain, Vikings wore undergarments made of linen, derived from the flax plant. Fresh linen is a crisp, cool fabric. But over time, with sweat and dirt, linen turns a dingy grey or yellow. To get it back to that blinding, high-status white, regular soap wasn't enough. You needed bleach. And the best source of ammonia, nature's bleach, was urine, specifically stale urine. When urine is allowed to sit and ferment for a few days, the urea breaks down into ammonia. Ammonia is a powerhouse cleaner. It cuts through grease, it kills bacteria, and, most importantly, it whitens fabrics. So, in a Viking household, there was likely a designated pot or vat where urine was collected. This wasn't waste. It was a cleaning product. On laundry day, the white linen undertunics would be soaked in this vat of fermented urine. It sounds repulsive to us, but the science is sound. After the soak, the linens would be hauled to the river or the stream. This is where the hard labour began. Doing laundry in the Viking Age was a CrossFit workout. The women, and it was almost exclusively women's work, would take the soaked, heavy clothes down to the water's edge. They would use wooden beaters or battledores to pound the fabric against rocks or wooden boards. This mechanical action, combined with the flowing water, rinsed out the urine, the soap, and the dirt. The result was linen that was shockingly white and fresh. Once dried in the wind and sun, the smell of ammonia would dissipate completely, leaving only the scent of fresh air and clean fabric. Imagine the visual impact of this. A Viking leader steps off his ship. He is wearing a cloak of dyed wool, maybe a deep red or blue, colours that also indicated wealth. But peeking out from the collar and the cuffs is his undertunic, and it is blindingly white. It catches the sun. To a peasant in a rural village who washes their clothes in plain water and wears eternal shades of brown and grey, this Viking looks almost supernatural. He looks bright. The contrast between the dark armour, the dyed wool, and the crisp white linen was a deliberate fashion statement. It said, "I have the resources to waste good fat on soap. I have the servants to beat my clothes at the river. I care about how I look." However, they had to be careful with their wool. You can't wash wool in hot water or harsh lye, or it will felt, shrink, and mat. Wool retains its natural oils, lanolin, which makes it water-resistant, crucial for sailing in the North Atlantic. So the Vikings likely had a dual system of laundry. The linens were boiled, bleached, and beaten for purity. The wools were gently rinsed and aired out to maintain their weatherproofing. This cycle of laundry was constant. We find smoother stones and glass linen smoothers in Viking graves. These look like large flattened paperweights made of dark glass. For a long time, archaeologists didn't know what they were. We now believe they were the Viking equivalent of an iron. After the linen was washed and dried, it would be wrinkled. To get that crisp, smooth look, a woman would place the fabric on a whalebone board and rub it vigorously with the heavy glass smoother. Friction and pressure would press the fibres flat, giving the tunic a polished, slightly glossy finish. These glass smoothers are often found in the graves of wealthy women. It suggests that the ability to present a smooth, unwrinkled appearance was a point of female pride and household status. A good wife ensured her husband and family didn't just look clean, they looked pressed. So, when we talk about Viking hygiene, we aren't just talking about body odour. We are talking about an industrial process of textile maintenance. We are talking about collecting raw chemical ingredients, fat, ash, urine, processing them, and using manual labour to maintain a visual standard. This context makes the muddy barbarian trope even more ridiculous. If a Viking fell in the mud during a battle, his first thought after, "Am I alive?" would probably be, "This is going to take 3 days to wash out." But there is a dark side to this obsession with cleanliness. We've talked about the idealized image, the white linen, the bleached hair, the Saturday bath. But the Vikings didn't live in a sterile laboratory. They lived in a world of livestock, wood floors, and open fires. And despite their best efforts with lye and steam, there were some things they couldn't wash away. Beneath the clean clothes and the scrubbed skin, the Vikings were fighting a losing war against an invisible enemy. And when we look at the microscopic evidence from their settlements, the clean image gets a little bit itchier. We have now built a complete picture of the Viking regimen. The Saturday bath, the specialized tools, the bleaching soap, the saunas, and the pressed white linens. To us, this sounds like a healthy, admirable lifestyle. But to the people who were actually being invaded by the Vikings, this obsession with grooming wasn't just surprising, it was a threat. It turns out that one of the most dangerous weapons the Vikings brought to England wasn't the battle axe, it was sex appeal. This sounds like a joke, or perhaps the plot of a bad romance novel, but it is a matter of historical record. Our primary witness for this is a chronicler named John of Wallingford. He was an English monk, later the abbot of St. Albans, writing in the 13th century. However, he was compiling much older traditions and documents from the height of the Danelaw, the period when Vikings controlled half of England. John was writing a history of why the English people had suffered so much, and why the Danes, the Vikings, had been so successful. Usually, chroniclers blamed military defeat on the sins of the people. God is punishing us because we aren't pious enough. But John offered a more practical and far more scandalous reason for the Viking success. He wrote that the Danes were making the Englishmen look bad. Here is the crux of his complaint. He noted that the Vikings were, by nature, ambitious and arrogant, but then he lists their specific tactics for social dominance. He writes that they were wont, after the fashion of their country, to comb their hair every day, to bathe every Saturday, to change their garments often, and to set off their persons by many such frivolous devices. Read that again. Combing hair every day, bathing every Saturday, changing clothes often. To a modern reader, this sounds like the bare minimum for being a functioning adult. But John calls them frivolous devices. He frames basic hygiene as a trick, a snare, a form of cheating. Why? Because of the result. He continues, "In this manner they laid siege to the virtue of the married women, and persuaded the daughters even of the nobles to be their concubines. This is a bombshell of a historical statement. The chronicler is essentially admitting that the Viking invaders were stealing the wives and daughters of the English nobility not by force, but by being better groomed than the English husbands. To understand the weight of this, we have to look at the cultural context of Anglo-Saxon England. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Anglo-Saxons were Christianized. The church had a complicated view of the body. While cleanliness was next to godliness in a spiritual sense, excessive attention to the physical body was often frowned upon. Vanity was a sin. A monk or a pious man was supposed to be concerned with his soul, not the shine of his hair. This doesn't mean the English were filthy, they certainly washed, but it wasn't a ritual, it wasn't a priority. It was something you did when you were dirty, not something you did to look good. Then come the Vikings. They are pagans, mostly. They don't share this Christian guilt about the flesh. They view the body as a vessel for honour. They view grooming as a display of self-respect. They walk into an English village and they are taller due to a better protein-rich diet. They are wearing those bright white linens we discussed. Their hair is bleached and combed, and they smell like soap and wood smoke. Contrast this with the local English lord, who perhaps bathes irregularly, wears wool that hasn't been blocked with a glass smoother, and considers a comb to be a tool for women. It was a complete mismatch. The Vikings were the rock stars of the Dark Ages. They brought a glamour, an exoticism, and a standard of presentation that the locals simply couldn't compete with. John of Wallingford's complaint reveals a deep insecurity in English society. The Vikings weren't just winning on the battlefield, they were winning the culture war. They were integrating themselves into the top tiers of society by marrying into noble families. And they were doing it by being more attractive partners. This seduction narrative challenges the popular image of the Viking as a rapist and pillager. While there is no denying the brutality of Viking raids, slavery and sexual violence were horrific realities of warfare in this era, the settlement phase was different. When Vikings settled in the Danelaw, places like York, Lincoln and Derby, they lived side by side with the English. They traded, they farmed, and, evidently, they dated. The fact that English women preferred them suggests that the Vikings as monsters narrative was, in part, propaganda created by rejected English men. It is a tale as old as time. The newcomers arrive, they have a different style, the local women find it intriguing, and the local men react with jealousy and slander. John of Wallingford wasn't just recording history, he was venting a centuries-old grievance. There is also a political dimension to this hygiene. In the feudal system, marriage was about alliances. If a Viking warlord could marry an English noblewoman, he gained a legitimate claim to land. He gained ties to the local kinship networks. By presenting themselves as clean, wealthy and aristocratic, through grooming, the Vikings were making themselves eligible bachelors. They were signalling that they were not barbarians to be feared, but lords to be courted. The everyday combing mentioned by Wallingford is significant. It implies a daily routine. Imagine the scene. A Viking warrior wakes up. Before he grabs his axe, before he eats his breakfast, he sits down, takes his antler comb out of its case, and grooms his hair and beard. This is discipline. It is a meditative act. It orders the mind for the day. This daily ritual might have been interpreted by the English as effeminate or frivolous, because it was time taken away from work or prayer. But for the Viking, it was the opposite of effeminate. It was the armour of a man who controls his destiny. If you can't control your own hair, How can you control a ship in a storm? How can you control a shield wall? We can also look at the linguistic legacy of this cultural clash. In English, we have words like skirt, sky, skin, and ugly, all loanwords from Old Norse. But we also have evidence of cultural borrowing in fashion. Over time, the Anglo-Saxons started to copy the Vikings. The shaved neck style we discussed earlier? It eventually became so popular that the English church had to issue warnings against it. They told Englishmen not to dress like the heathen Danes. This is the ultimate proof of the Vikings' soft power. You don't copy the haircut of a person you think is a dirty savage. You copy the haircut of the person you want to be. The Englishmen, seeing that their wives and daughters were impressed by the Vikings, started to adopt the very styles they claimed to hate. So, John of Wallingford's bitter chronicle gives us a window into a fascinating social dynamic. It tells us that hygiene was a disruptor. It was a wedge that the Vikings drove into English society. It separated the old guard from the new invaders. It also humanizes the Viking women. While Wallingford focuses on the men seducing English women, we must remember the Viking women, the shield maidens and the housewives who were maintaining these standards. They were the ones often making the soap, heating the water, and smoothing the linen. They were the guardians of this culture of cleanliness. A Viking woman would likely have found an Anglo-Saxon man with his uncombed beard and irregular bathing habits repulsive. In conclusion on this point, the Vikings didn't just conquer England with swords. They conquered it with combs. They brought a standard of living that was aspirational. They showed the medieval world that you could be a fierce warrior and still smell good. And for the poor monks writing the history books, that was the most annoying thing of all. But, as we hinted at before, no amount of combing or scrubbing can protect you from everything. While the Vikings looked great on the surface and smelled better than their neighbours, they were hiding a dirty secret. Quite literally, inside them. It is time to leave the romance and the seduction behind and descend into the microscopic reality of the Viking gut. We have spent the last 30 minutes painting a picture of the Viking as a paragon of cleanliness. We've seen the combs, the saunas, the bleached hair, and the white linen. It is a compelling image. It is a truthful image. But it is not the whole truth. If you were to step out of a time machine into the Viking city of Jorvik, modern-day York, in the year 950 AD, the first thing to hit you wouldn't be the sight of beautiful people. It would be the smell. You see, while the Vikings were experts at personal grooming, they were living in the dark ages of urban sanitation. They didn't understand germ theory. They didn't know that invisible creatures lived in the water and the soil. And because of this ignorance, despite their Saturday baths, they were walking biological disasters. To understand this grit, we have to look at the ground beneath their feet. In the 1970s, archaeologists in York made a discovery that changed everything. They began excavating the Coppergate area. Because the soil there is waterlogged and oxygen-free, anoxic, it preserved organic matter that usually rots away. It preserved wood, leather, cloth, and excrement. Tons of it. The excavation revealed that Viking houses were tightly packed together. In the backyard of almost every plot there was a hole, a cesspit. This was the toilet, and it was often dug frighteningly close to the well where they drew their drinking water. You don't need a degree in microbiology to see the problem here. Cross-contamination was inevitable. But the most famous artifact from York isn't a sword or a helmet. It is a piece of fossilized human feces. It is known formally as the Lloyd's Bank coprolite, named after the bank that was built over the site. It is 7 inches long and 2 inches wide. It is massive. It is, to date, the largest fossilized human turd ever discovered. It is so significant that it has its own glass display case in the Jorvik Viking Centre. Why are we talking about 1,000-year-old poop? Because it is a time capsule. Paleoscatologists, yes, scientists who study ancient excrement, have dissected this specimen. What they found inside destroys the superhuman image of the Viking warrior. The creator of this deposit was eating a diet of meat and bread, which is to be expected. But he was also infested. The sample was riddled with the eggs of Trichuris tricura, whipworm, and Ascaris lumbricoides, moorworm. These aren't harmless passengers. The moorworm is a parasitic roundworm that can grow up to a foot long inside the human intestine. Imagine that. A foot-long worm writhing in your gut, stealing your nutrients. The whipworm burrows into the lining of the large intestine. The man who produced this sample wasn't just a little sick. He was likely in chronic pain. He would have suffered from stomach cramps, diarrhea, stunted growth, and, perhaps most distractingly, constant, maddening itching. And this wasn't an isolated case. Analysis of the soil in York shows that everyone had worms. The entire population was walking around with a gut full of parasites. Why? Because of how they lived. Inside the Viking longhouse, the hygiene situation was complex. The floor was usually dirt or stamped earth, covered in rushes or straw. When the straw got dirty with food scraps, spit, or animal waste, because the animals often lived in one end of the house during winter, they didn't always sweep it out. Sometimes they just put fresh straw on top. This created a layer cake of filth on the floor that was a perfect breeding ground for fleas, lice, and bacteria. So while a Viking might wash his face and comb his hair, he was walking on a floor that was teeming with life. Then there is the issue of toilet paper. What did a Viking use after visiting the cesspit? They didn't have charmin. In the excavations, archaeologists found piles of moss, specifically Diphasium complanatum, along with the cesspits. Moss is soft, absorbent, and has mild antiseptic properties. It was the toilet paper of the north. In other areas, they might have used wool scraps or even a cleaning stick, a scraper. But the moss tells us they were trying, they were wiping. But without the ability to wash their hands with antibacterial soap afterwards, the fecal-oral route of infection remained open. Furthermore, their diet, while hearty, was a vector for disease. They loved meat, pork, beef, and fish, but they didn't always cook it to the internal temperatures recommended by the FDA. Undercooked pork is a highway for trichinosis. Dried fish, if not cured properly, can harbour bacteria. And let's not forget the water. They drank ale and mead, yes, but they also drank water. And if that water came from a well situated 10 feet from a leaking cesspit, it was a cocktail of pathogens. Dysentery was likely a common killer. There is another silent killer in the Viking home: smoke. A longhouse has no chimney. It has a hole in the roof. The fire sits in the middle of the floor. In winter, you want to keep the heat in, so you close the doors. The house fills with smoke. It hovers in the rafters, but it also fills the lungs. Osteologists, bone specialists, who study Viking skeletons often find evidence of chronic sinusitis and respiratory infections. Their lungs would have been black, similar to the lungs of a heavy chain smoker today. This constant smoke exposure irritated the eyes, leading to widespread eye infections and likely early-onset cataracts or blindness. So, when the sagas talk about an old, blind, wise man, he wasn't necessarily blind from a mystical vision. He was probably blind because he had been sitting in a smoke-filled room for 50 years. This brings us to a fascinating paradox. The Viking was an external neat freak and an internal disaster zone. He would bleach his hair to kill lice. He would steam his skin to open his pores. He would wash his clothes in ammonia to make them white. But inside, his body was fighting a war against worms, bacteria, and smoke. This reality checks our admiration. It reminds us that hygiene is a technology. The Vikings had mastered the macro technology: soap, combs, saunas. But they lacked the micro technology: antibiotics, water filtration, separation of waste. It also changes how we view their temperament. Historians often wonder why Vikings were so aggressive, so irritable, so quick to anger. We usually attribute it to their culture of honour or the harsh environment. But consider the biological factor. Imagine you are a warrior. You are cold. You are living in a house filled with smoke that stings your eyes. You have intestinal worms causing you abdominal pain. You have lice bites on your scalp, despite the bleaching. You are physically miserable much of the time. Would you be in a good mood? Or would you be ready to grab an axe and sail to a warmer country to take someone else's gold? The physical misery of the medieval world is a driver of history that we often overlook. The Vikings weren't supermen. They were suffering men. And their obsession with laugardagr, Saturday bath, might have been more than just vanity. It might have been a desperate attempt to feel clean in a world that was fundamentally dirty. They were fighting the entropy of filth, and while they lost the war against the parasites, as everyone did until the 20th century, they won the battle for dignity. They refused to look like the animals they lived with. But there is one final act in the Viking hygiene drama. We have looked at how they lived, how they washed, and how they suffered. Now we must look at how they died. Because for a Viking, the ultimate grooming session didn't happen before a date or a battle. It happened after the heart stopped beating. We have reached the end of the Viking life cycle. The warrior has lived his days bathing on Saturdays, combing his beard, bleaching his hair, and perhaps struggling with the hidden parasites of his time. But now the thread of his life has been cut by the Norns. He is dead. In many cultures, death is a messy, frightening business that is quickly hidden away. But in the Viking world, death was a public performance. And just as in life, appearance mattered. In fact, it mattered more. To understand Viking burial hygiene, we have to understand their concept of the afterlife. Whether they believed they were going to Valhalla, Odin's hall, Folkvanga, Freya's field, or Hell, the underworld, they believed they were going somewhere. And they believed they were arriving as guests. You do not show up to a god's hall looking like a corpse. You show up looking like a hero. This belief system triggered a rigorous post-mortem grooming ritual. The moment a person died, the care for their body shifted from health to presentation. The first step was the washing of the body, the nabjargir. This was typically performed by the women of the household or specific elder women in the community. They would close the eyes and the mouth, sometimes sewing the mouth shut to prevent the soul from re-entering or evil spirits from entering. Then they would wash the corpse. This wasn't a quick rinse. We have accounts, particularly from the observant and horrified Ibn Fadlan, describing the preparation of a high-status chieftain for his funeral. The body was not just washed, it was groomed. The hair was combed one last time, the beard was trimmed and arranged, the fingernails were cut. Why cut the nails? This connects to a terrifying piece of Norse mythology. The Vikings believed that at Ragnarok, the end of the world, a great ship called Naglfar would set sail to carry the army of giants to battle against the gods. Naglfar was made entirely from the uncut fingernails of dead men. Therefore, if you died with long nails, you were contributing building materials to the ship that would destroy the universe. By trimming the nails of the dead, the Vikings believed they were delaying the apocalypse. It is a perfect example of how hygiene was linked to cosmic survival. Once washed and groomed, the body was dressed, but not in a simple shroud. A Viking was dressed in their absolute best. Archaeology confirms this. When we open a grave, we often find traces of high-quality textiles. In the Oseberg ship burial, the two women were found with remnants of fine imported silk, likely from as far away as Persia, complex wool tapestries, and linen. They were dressed for a royal reception. For a warrior, this meant his best tunic, his cloak, his belt with the shiny bronze fittings, but it also meant his hygiene kit. As we mentioned earlier, the comb was placed by the hand or at the waist, but sometimes we find even more intimate items: wash basins, towels. Yes, towels. We have evidence of textile fragments that appear to be hand towels included in grave goods. This implies that the dead person might need to wash their face again on the other side. The most spectacular account of this cleanliness for the dead comes again from Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Rus, or Viking, funeral on the Volga in 922 AD. He describes a ritual that is both fascinating and grotesque. He writes that the dead chieftain was placed in a temporary grave for 10 days, while his funeral clothes were being sewn. During this time, his body turned black from the cold. When they exhumed him for the final cremation on the ship, they didn't just throw him on the pyre. They dressed him in trousers, leggings, boots, a tunic and a caftan of brocade with gold buttons, and a cap of sable fur. They essentially gave him a makeover. They made him look alive, wealthy, and kingly. This obsession with the visual state of the corpse serves a psychological purpose for the living too. A good death looked peaceful. A bad death looked messy. By cleaning the body, combing the hair, and dressing it in finery, the survivors were reassuring themselves that their loved one was still themselves. They were restoring the dignity that death steals away. But there is a darker side to burial hygiene. In some cases, the cleaning involved sacrifice. In the same account by Ibn Fadlan, before the chieftain is burned, a slave girl volunteers to die with him. Before she is killed, she goes through a ritual of purification. She washes her hands and feet. She drinks ritual beverages. She is essentially preparing herself to be a clean offering. This connects back to the idea that you cannot interact with the divine while unclean. Even the cremation itself can be seen as a form of ultimate hygiene. Fire is a purifier. It reduces the decaying, rotting flesh to clean white bone and ash. It transforms the biological mess of a dead body into something stable and eternal. The smoke carries the essence of the person up to the sky, bypassing the slow, dirty process of decomposition in the ground. For those buried in mounds, inhumation, the hygiene was about preservation. The chamber was often lined with wood or textiles to create a room. They weren't just dumping a body in dirt. They were placing a groomed person in a furnished apartment. In the end, the Viking grave is a mirror of the Viking life. It is filled with tools for maintenance. It is filled with evidence of vanity. And it is filled with the stubborn refusal to be reduced to nothingness. When a Viking died, he didn't want to be remembered as a rotting corpse. He wanted to be remembered as he was on a Saturday night, fresh from the bath, hair bleached white, linen shining, ready for the feast. And now we must step back. We have journeyed through the bathhouse, the laundry, the latrine, and the grave. It is time to look at the big picture. What does all this mean for us, the modern viewers? Why does it matter that Vikings used ear spoons? Let's conclude our saga. We began this documentary with a challenge. I asked you to close your eyes and picture a Viking. I asked you to confront the image of the dirty, mud-caked barbarian that has dominated our screens for decades. Now, I want you to picture him again. This time, see him correctly. See the man who wakes up early to comb his hair. See the man who carries a specialized kit of tweezers and ear spoons on his belt, treasured as much as his sword. See the man who spends his Saturday evenings in a steam-filled bathhouse, scrubbing away the grime of the week with soap he made himself from ash and fat. See the man who wears linen bleached white with ammonia, standing tall in a world that is often dark and dirty. This new image is not less terrifying. In fact, it is more so. A wild, dirty savage is an animal. He is chaotic. He is reactive. But a clean, groomed warrior? That is a man of discipline. That is a man of focus. That is a man who controls his environment, his body, and his destiny. The hygiene of the Vikings was not just about vanity, it was a survival strategy. In the harsh climate of the north, keeping clean meant keeping healthy. It meant avoiding the lice and infections that could kill you just as dead as a spear. It was a way of maintaining morale in the long, dark winters. It was also a social weapon. It allowed them to navigate the courts of Europe, to seduce into noble families, and to present themselves not just as raiders, but as rulers. They used their appearance to say, "We belong here. We are worthy." The myth of the dirty Viking says more about us than it does about them. It reflects our need to put the past into neat little boxes, civilized versus savage, clean versus dirty. But history is never that simple. The Vikings were a paradox. They were brutal warriors who loved poetry. They were raiders who built international trade networks. And they were killers who cared deeply about their conditioner. So the next time you watch a movie and see a Viking roll in the mud, you have my permission to roll your eyes. You know the truth now. You know that if Ragnar Lothbrok were alive today, he wouldn't be covered in dirt. He'd probably be asking where the sauna is.